talk about a study that got done in 1980 by two economists named Clinard and Yeager. So, Clinard and Yeager were interested in studying white collar crime, and they conducted a study in 1980 where they examined 477 corporations. So, this was a really big study. And these corporations, all of them got into the study because they had criminal, civil, or administrative cases being filed against them. So, these were basically, essentially to them, kind of your quintessential corporate crime uh, cases. And what Clinard and Yeager wanted to do is they just wanted to understand kind of the pattern of white collar offending. So they found some kind of interesting things. First of all, they found that there were a few number of deviant firms that accounted for over half of all of the white collar uh, cases being filed against companies in the past several years. So if you think about, you know, that idea that a small number of the companies were accounting for over half of the total amount of white collar crime, that should strike a chord with you guys. That should sound familiar. If you think back to what we know about individuals and individual behavior from the work of Marvin Wolfgang, we know that this number sounds about right. That a small number of firms are probably the most to blame. They also found that the larger corporations were the chief violators. That small corporations don't tend to at least be charged and be um, sentenced with as many white collar offenses as larger corporations. But according to them, the chief violators are oil, pharmaceutical, and automobile companies. And they also found a kind of persistent trait over a few decades leading up to 1980, which is the fact that there is a great amount of leniency in the court system in terms of the type and amount of punishment being doled out for white collar offenses. Criminal um, criminal court, civil administrative court just doesn't treat the people who are convicted of white collar offenses really with the same level of severity as they do other types of crimes. So Clinard and Yeager pointed this out as perhaps a place where we want to maybe take another look and see if we might be able to devise better and more accurate punishments for white collar offenders. So starting in the mid to late 1960s, people really started to change their perspective on how serious they wanted to consider white collar offending. I think up to this point, people just really weren't that concerned with what businessmen were doing that might be considered illegal. But as we know at this point in this class, the mid and late 1960s sparked a really dramatic change in a lot of different types of crim theory and criminological thinking. And the perspective about white collar crime also saw a lot of change during this time period because during this time period, this is when we as a country really started to kind of mistrust those people in power, those people that we had considered basically above kind of the law that was supposed to be dealing with petty, index, violent, predatory crimes. People all of a sudden started to say, no, even those people, those powerful people in charge of corporations and businesses, they should be held accountable for their actions. We also know that in terms of the civil rights movement, what was coming out of that's relevant here is a push for equality above all else. And in terms of the civil rights movement, leaders of that time period looked at white collar offending and saw it kind of as a white man's crime, that we are systematically, essentially, decriminalizing and ignoring. And leaders of the civil rights movement became upset and were calling for us to stop ignoring the crimes of the wealthy. And the environmental movements that also have subsequently followed this era have really pushed for corporations to disclose a lot more about. Sorry for the cutoff on that last slide, but what I was going to say about the environmental movements is essentially that environmental movements after the 1960s really started to push for corporations to be much more open and upfront about how they were not only dealing with their finances and potential to, defraud the public, but also how they were dealing with pollutants that they might be putting back into the environment, and how that might also pose uh, potential for white collar crime. So, when you think about why we should study white collar crime, not only should we study it because it's a type of offending and it deserves our understanding, um, but there are a lot of economic and social costs to think about here in terms of why we're going to study white collar crime. One of the biggest reasons why people would argue that study of white collar crime is important is the sheer size of the cost that individual cases, individual white collar crime offenses can incur. And you think about things like the Enron scandal, the BP oil spill, um, any number of famous cases. You're talking about small groups of people, probably, who are chiefly responsible for making the larger decisions that are leading to these offenses taking place. And these offenses costing either shareholders or the public billions of dollars, millions and billions of dollars worth of damages, worth of costs. I mean, there are people who coming out of the Enron scandal, lost their entire jobs, their pensions, their livelihoods. It's very hard to actually even quantify sometimes the amount of economic cost that white collar crime can lead to. So that's, the economic costs are kind of obvious, an obvious reason that we should study this type of offending because these each individual offenses can hit the public so hard. But there are also some social costs to consider. First of all, white collar crime is something that, again, is done in the course of normal business. It's basically a job that's kind of done under the table, behind closed doors, in a very secretive way. And it essentially, one of the arguments for why we should study it is white collar crime has basically led to a breakdown in trust between the American public and the people that we trust in corporate business roles. So, the violation of trust issue is an important reason to study white collar crime. The physical costs of white collar crime are also incredibly large. You think about, some famous examples of companies that have basically cut corners to put out products that maybe aren't completely safe or cut corners in how they're disposing of waste. All of those things have physical costs to people, to the environment, and again, these costs are hard to quantify, but when you actually compare the costs of these kind of offenses to maybe your more street-level predatory offenses, many would argue that these are at least just as harmful, if not more. So all theories of crime, when you're thinking about, why we should study white-collar crime, we really don't have a good theory in criminology to really perfectly address white-collar crime. That's another really good reason that we need to study it, because we don't really have, on the books anyway, a good traditional theory that can address white-collar crime in a good way. That being said, there's a reason that even though interest in white-collar crime started in the 1960s, there hasn't exactly been a huge dearth of literature that has come out about white-collar crime. And that's because the study of white-collar crime is extremely difficult. So think about, for example, think about in your head a famous example of a white-collar offense. Say the Madoff scandal, Bernard Madoff. Think about why it might have been that it was so difficult to actually detect and identify and convict this person. Well, there's a lot of different reasons why studying white-collar crime is so difficult. Let's go through some of them now. First of all, we know that some corporations have what we call codes of silence, that essentially you sign after becoming a member of a company saying that you are not going to disclose business activities that go on within the corporation. So in that way, it's really hard for a researcher. Think of yourself as a budding researcher interested in white-collar crime. It's really hard to just go into a company and try to explore their criminal activity because not a lot of members of that company are going to want to talk to you. Another reason that studying white-collar crime is so difficult is getting away from kind of the large level, the corporate level criminal activity. What about those occupational white collar criminals, individuals acting on their own to slowly embezzle money. Well, a lot of times if a company detects that happening, instead of uh, instead of having the public come in and gain access to information about the company, they'll just fire that person. So it's a lot better for a company sometimes if they detect that somebody's committing crime in their midst. It's a lot better for them to just fire that person and avoid the scandal than to bring actual formal charges on people. So it might be the case that this is an incredibly underreported crime. We also don't really have great viable statistics on occupational or kind of corporate white collar crime. When you think about kind of your predatory street level offenses, we've got the UCR that we can get information from. We've got NIBRS, we've got the NCVS, victimization surveys. We don't have a viable statistical place to draw from if we want data on occupational crime. It just doesn't exist in this country. So if you were a researcher who was interested in this, you couldn't just look up a data set and start doing work. It would take the task of trying to draw your own data from a company, and that's very difficult to do. Another reason that studying white-collar crime is difficult is when people violate and commit white-collar crimes, a lot of times they're not breaking the criminal code, but they are breaking civil and administrative law. And criminologists don't really have a lot of experience in the understanding of the intricacies that go on in civil and administrative law. So a lot of times, if you're a criminologist, you kind of want to stick with what you know and what you understand and what you typically study. And white collar crime and civil and administrative law is a pretty dramatic departure from our typical types of study. And probably one of the biggest reasons, all of these reasons that I've just talked about, those are definitely difficulties and challenges, but the very nature of how white-collar crime happens is probably the biggest limitation to it being studied. And that's because white-collar crime is usually something that doesn't just happen in one day. It's a systematic series of actions over time done under the table in the course of normal business. It's very difficult to detect. It's very complex. It's often very difficult to figure out exactly who is and is not involved in white-collar crime. So all of these are really big reasons why white-collar crime is an incredibly difficult thing to actually study. Now, those who have tried to study white-collar crime have pointed out that despite kind of the public stereotypical image of what a white-collar offender is, there are some misconceptions about your typical white-collar offender. So if I were to ask you guys in class, give me what does a typical white-collar offender look like? You would probably describe to me somebody like Bernard Madoff, a rich, white, old man, essentially. And in reality, that's just not exactly the case. From what we know from research done on white-collar crime, and again, this is considering both individual level, occupational white-collar offenders and kind of corporate crime incidents. What we know is your typical white-collar offender is middle class, somebody who does not have a six-figure income, somebody who has a moderate income, and somebody who is working somewhere in the mid-level of their company. That's your typical white-collar offender. We know that some of the most famous cases that come out usually are involving the larger corporate scandals. You tend to have a different face to those white-collar offenses, but the most people who get caught, convicted, sentenced for white-collar offenses are middle class, middle income, mid-level workers within their companies. Another interesting reality about white-collar crime is the fact that many of these people are repeat offenders, not necessarily all the time for just white-collar crime either. Some people often think of white-collar offenders as being people who, other than that particular offense, have never done anything else wrong. And, what we know from actually studying people who've been convicted is that's really not the case, that white-collar offenders often have an arrest record, and often for things that are not always just white-collar crime. But nonetheless, most people do acknowledge that your typical white-collar offender still has somewhat of a different kind of background and pathway into their offending than your typical ordinary street offender. Most people who commit white collar crime do it later on in their lives because they're doing it in the conducting of of an occupation. So this isn't an adolescent, young adult crime. This is an adult, older adult type of offense.